Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught. I'm the content director at Word on Fire. And joining me is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, we always love to have you.
Brandon, it's always a joy to be on this program with you.
Now, it's been a few weeks since your trip to Krakow for World Youth Day, and we haven't talked about it yet. So give us some feedback. What was it like? What were some of the major experiences there at World Youth Day?
Unbelievable. It was one of the great experiences of my life. I really mean that. I think of the first night when I met through the good ministrations of George Weigel. I met with a number of these men and women now in their high 70s and 80s who were members of John Paul II's youth group back in the 1940s and 50s. These were the young people that Karol Wojtyła gathered at St. Florian's Parish in Krakow. And they became the core of World Youth Day. Because with these people, he went kayaking and he went skiing and camping. And on those trips, he formed them in Catholic spirituality and theology. And despite all the efforts of the communist authorities to shape young people, Karol Wojtyła wanted to counter-shape, a group. And these people stayed with him all those years as he married them and baptized their children and their grandchildren. They came to see him when he was Pope in Rome. It was very moving. I'm there in this kind of little hot apartment and with these wonderful people, along with several bishops. Cardinal Dolan was there. Bishop Paprocki of Springfield was there. Bishop Conley of Lincoln. All people that have a real devotion to John Paul II. And these wonderful people told us story after story about him. And as they were telling the story, through the open windows, we could hear all the songs and the chants and the cries of these young people gathering in Krakow. And it just struck me with enormous power that here's the core group. Here's the original seed that grew into the, mustard tree of World Youth Day. And so it's a very moving experience. They told us that Wojtyła often met with them in that very room, that he celebrated Mass. And so even to be in that place where a great saint operated, but particularly this saint, who's been so impactful on me and so many others. So anyway, that was a great highlight. The second highlight was that wonderful evening with 25,000 people in the arena. And we had Eucharistic adoration, benediction. I gave a little fervorino. But the thrill was to go into that room and to watch these young people respond to the Blessed Sacrament. And with the music playing, with banners of the great Polish martyrs hanging overhead, it was one of the most moving experiences I've had in 30 years as a priest. So those two things really stay in my mind powerfully from World Youth Day.
Well, today we're going to be kicking off a new series here on the podcast. We're going to be devoting the next 6 episodes to each of the 6 pivotal players who are featured in your new film series, Catholicism, The Pivotal Players. It's getting ready to be released here on September 1st. I'd encourage all the listeners to go to pivotalplayers.com to watch some sample video clips and also pre-order your copy. Today we're going to be looking at St. Francis, the Reformer. Real quickly, the other 5 pivotal players include St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Catherine of Siena, Blessed John Henry Newman, G.K. Chesterton, and Michelangelo. And we're going to devote one episode to each of them. But today we're looking at St. Francis. So let's start off with a brief sketch, Bishop. Who was St. Francis?
Oh, fascinating figure. Italian, so born at the end of the 12th century, lived into the beginning of the 13th century. Didn't live very long, died in his early 40s. St. Francis was from, of course, the wonderful Umbrian town of Assisi. As a young man, motivated by worldly values, wanted to become, rich. And he was a bit of a bon vivant, and I use French there on purpose because he loved the songs of the French troubadours. Yeah, he loved the pretty girls. He loved, the good life. And then through a series of experiences, he undergoes a massive conversion and gives his life utterly to Christ in poverty. And it's fair to say that at the beginning, St. Francis had no sense of, I'm here to reform the church. I think he was just a person responding to the invitation of Christ. But people immediately saw there was something refreshing and new and powerful in this life he was leading of poverty, simplicity, trust in providence, service of the poor. And they came. First, a group of 12, almost an imitation of Christ. And then, before you knew it, thousands had gathered around this simple poor man who, was not well educated, was barely literate, was not intending to found an order. I mean, all that would be anachronistic to say, but I find it more moving for that reason, that here's this simple man whose witness was so powerful that thousands came. And that's the beginning of the Franciscan order that we know today. He was a man, I would say, of Christian radicalism. And at a time when the church was in deep corruption, especially the clergy, Francis, almost despite himself, again, not intending to do it, but simply by the witness of his life, brings people back to evangelical radicalism. And I mean the roots, the foundations of the gospel. And in that, he launches a real social revolution. And what's so moving to me is, I'm recording these words in Santa Barbara, California, and I'm 5 minutes away from the Franciscan mission that was founded by St. Francis' distant son, Junipero Serra, Franciscans who brought the faith here. They're still there. You go over there and you'll see these wonderful men in the brown habit, which is evocative of the simple garb that Francis wore. And so the power of his personality is impossible to deny. I'll take you right down the street and you can see it.
You say at the beginning of the Pivotal Players episode on St. Francis that even for non-believers, St. Francis seems to sum up what is best in the Christian tradition, and it would be difficult to find anyone, even the most ardent of atheists, who would stand against him. Why do you think St. Francis is so universally attractive, maybe more so than any other Catholic saint?
And I think that's true, what you just said. And often it's been pointed out that he's like another Christ. In fact, whole religious movements emerged in the Middle Ages around that idea that the second Christ had come, and so something cataclysmic was going to happen. I think after Jesus himself, he's the one who best embodies Christianity in full, pure Christianity without corruption, Christianity that's authentic and true to its founder. And again, I'd say it's simplicity of life, it's love for the poor, it's radical trust in divine providence, it's a preaching of the gospel in simplicity and poverty. I think that just appeals the same way that Jesus himself appeals. The fact that Francis, as far as we know, some say St. Paul might have had this stigmata, but the first saint that we know who bears the literal wounds of Jesus. And those accounts, you'll see it in the program that we did, they're not just wounds in the hands. They're real nails. The head of a nail coming out of the palm of his hand, the back of the nail coming out the back of the hand, and the same with his feet. People saw that. I mean, it's well attested. What does that mean? See, for a lot of people, it meant, wow, Jesus has come again. This is the second Christ. And I think even today in our very skeptical age, we find something just irresistibly compelling about him.
I think if you ask the average person on the street who St. Francis was, some of the first images they would have in mind are little lawn statues, maybe sitting in front of a yard or something like that. What would you say is the element or dimension of Francis that's perhaps most misunderstood or neglected among the common men?
Yeah, how frightening he was. I mean, most people, when they first ran into Francis, thought he was insane, and because who'd be living this way? Think of the famous scene, when his father challenges him before the bishop and the whole town is gathered and Francis blithely takes off all his clothes and walks naked, away. Well, people thought he was mad. Or he'd be encouraging his followers, his rich followers in some cases, stand in the middle of downtown in the square and just start throwing your money away. Well, imagine that today. So you're in Times Square, or you're at State Michigan in Chicago, or you're downtown LA, and you're a rich person, and there's a guy next to you wearing basically the garb of a street person who is telling you, throw your money away. Well, what would our reaction be? I'm sure we'd think both of them were certifiable. Well, that was the reaction to Francis. The other side is his really frightening asceticism. So there is the image, very romanticized, of Francis, kind of cavorting through the fields and preaching to the birds. And that's true. I don't want to deny that. That's true. But the other side of Francis is the one who fasted, who threw ashes on his food, the one who would endure all-night vigils, the one who would discipline his own body, etc. That's Francis too. And I think today we'd find that a little off-putting, but I want Francis in full. I want the whole Francis. Because same thing with Jesus too, right? People will take bits and pieces of the Lord's witness and message, but we want Jesus in full. And that's a little more frightening.
You said that perhaps no other saint was as configured to Christ as Francis was, both physically through the stigmata, but also throughout the rest of his life, the way he spoke, the way he lived, the way he acted. How did this come about? Talk a little bit about his conversion experience. How did he go from sort of the wild street playboy to this icon of Jesus Christ?
Yeah, I think there are, two moves. Call it one more natural, one more supernatural. From the natural side, and it happens to a lot of people. It happened to Augustine. Read the lives of so many of the saints. As they follow a worldly path, they find themselves at a dead end, not satisfied by the things they thought would satisfy them. That's what I want. I want to be famous, or I want to be a great warrior. I want to be rich. I want to be, the ladies' man. Fine, and you go down that path, and you go even all the way down that path. And then you find it's just not it. It's just not enough. It doesn't satisfy me. Francis, I think, experienced that very powerfully. And then also, not to put too fine a point on it, he was addressed by the Lord, both in dream and in vision, in locution. He was addressed by the Lord. And I think in certain rare cases, Christ does that. Typically, he doesn't, use locutions or visions to get through to most of us. He'll use the more ordinary means of the scriptures or the saints or other people, etc. But I think in some key cases, Mother Teresa comes to mind, where she literally hears a voice from Jesus directing her to her new vocation within a vocation. So I think he was summoned by Christ, and he responded. He cooperated with grace and gave himself completely. And he wanted to live as Jesus did. Poverty, simplicity, trust in the will of the Father, following the literal prompts of the gospel. He wanted to show that life was viable.
Francis's influence is perhaps most strongly felt today through the order he established, the Franciscans. You hinted earlier at one of its great followers, Junipero Serra. Talk about how this movement came about. You mentioned Francis wasn't intending to start an order, so how did it happen?
Yeah, I think it happened in, to me, almost a comical way. Because, unlike, let's say, St. Dominic had a more, I think, institutional frame of mind. And I think he, and certainly St. Ignatius did, is they saw themselves as founders of an order. And they thought it through, and they had, rather clear plans about it. None of that's true in the case of Francis. Francis was a troubadour of God who gave himself to God, lived a radical life, and it was immediately attractive. So people came. And, he's a generous spirit and was joyful to see that. And so he received first the 12, and they lived in, simple environments. But then suddenly, practically overnight, thousands came. Where are they going to live? And Francis would say, well, they can live out in the woods. What will they eat? They'll eat what God gives them, And I don't mean to sound flip about it. It's just that he was a saint. He was a mystic who was trusting in the Lord. And around that mystic came this community. Now, to be fair, in time, more, practically minded people sort of seized control of some of the practicalities and worried about things like housing and having enough money and property and so on. Now, mind you, go forward another 100 years or so, that's a huge argument within the Franciscan family, is the more radical people saying, hey, look, we've abandoned Francis. And then the more pragmatic people saying, yeah, but we need to have some order here. Anyway, I won't go into all that. Talk to the historians of the Franciscan order, and you can still see that tension to the present day within Franciscanism. I think it's fair to say Francis himself didn't envision some great movement, and it kind of happened around him. He was indispensable to it. They came because of him. His witness, his example, but it wasn't like he said, all right, now I'm going to, retire to write the constitutions of my order. And so to me, it's a fascinating example of how grace works.
800 years after Francis's death, we see Jorge Bergoglio elected Pope and significantly takes the name Francis. What do you take away from that choice?
Yeah, we're still teasing it out, aren't we? I remember when I was over there doing coverage for the conclave, and we heard this Jesuit has taken the name Francis. And I don't know if you remember this, but a lot of people thought, oh, he must mean Francis Xavier, the great Jesuit missionary. And, I thought, well, I guess why not? I mean, I don't really know. But then he clarified, no, he meant Francis of Assisi. Well, I mean, two things come right to mind, and we hear it constantly in our Pope, is don't forget the poor. The line that was whispered to him when he was elected Pope by one of his brother cardinals, don't forget the poor. And his love for those on the margins, his love for the periphery, his visits to the sick and the marginalized and the poor. I mean, that's a basic Franciscan impulse. Secondly, I'd say, is a great love for creation. And you saw it in Laudato Si, his encyclical on the environment, on care for the earth and nature. That's a very Franciscan theme. So I think in both those ways. And then, his current emphasis on the divine mercy. That's what Francis preached. So I think in all those ways, he intuited, though a Jesuit, he didn't call himself Ignatius. He intuited somehow what the church needs right now is a good dose of Francis.
One of the best books on St. Francis is the delicious collection of stories known as The Little Flowers of St. Francis, and it kind of calls to mind the little teachable anecdotes from Jewish rabbis or in the East from different holy men and women in the Orthodox tradition. Talk about some of your favorite Francis stories. I know you include some of them in the Pivotal Players episode, but what are some of the highlights for you?
Yeah, first, it is a great book. You're right, and you're furthermore right in saying it's like a lot of books in the spiritual traditions of the world. And I'd like to say something too that we can maybe too easily dismiss it as, charming and little legendary tales. But there's something about these really great spiritual people, especially founders of movements and orders, that I think God acts in rather decisive ways. Think when St. Paul says mysteriously in one of his letters that, I came to you not with convincing words, but with shows of power, displays of power. What did he mean? I mean, Paul was a man of words, God knows, but he said, I didn't come to you with convincing arguments. I came with displays of power. Well, I mean, it sounds like miracles to me. It sounds like some kind of display of the marvelous intervention of God. And that doesn't surprise me. Read the stories of many of the great missionaries when they go into a country for the first time. Their presence is often accompanied by the miraculous. Maybe my favorite is the Wolf of Gubbio. We have that story in the Pivotal Players, and this wolf that was threatening this town and killing the people, and they were terrified. And Francis comes in and with great courage meets the wolf and basically makes a deal. You don't harm the people, and they will agree to feed you. And the wolf acquiesces and becomes peaceful. And it catches so much of the Francis spirit, doesn't it? The outreach to nature. As he preached to the flowers and to the birds, well, he also preached to the wolf. There's something about the saint who's so deeply connected to God that through God, he becomes connected to all things. You know what I'm saying? That's a good biblical sense of ecology, that all of nature is connected to us and to all elements of nature through God. That comes through in the Wolf of Gubbio story. And also just that wonderful courage of Francis. Hey, my life is in the hands of God, and so I'll go out with courage to meet this ferocious beast. And he calms him. So I've always loved that story. The other one I'm very fond of is, his sort of teasing dialogue with one of his brothers, what's perfect happiness? And then he goes through this steady account of every possible suffering. Physical, psychological, rejection, everything. And when he's finally in hunger and pain and rejection, thrown out into the snow, then I found perfect happiness, Well, you say it's just perverse, but no, it's making that classic spiritual point. It's precisely in our detachment from all the things that lure us in the world that we find an openness to the will of God and a trust in his providence. So anyway, those are two of many, many wonderful stories in that book.
We're talking about Bishop Barron's new film series, Catholicism, the Pivotal Players, and each of the 6 episodes in the film, we're going to do a special podcast episode on here, and today we're looking at St. Francis. I'd like to close with a question that we'll finish each of these episodes with, and it's this: why is St. Francis a pivotal player?
Well, I think he's a pivotal player because he's another Christ. And he was a pivotal player in his own time for that reason. But I think up and down the ages, whenever someone incarnates the personality and mission and style of Christ, things will pivot around him. He'll make this decisive difference. In his own time, which was a time, as I say, of corruption, and the church was headed toward a worldliness. The church was collapsing of its own weight, you might say. Francis came and revitalized it. He breathed the breath of the Holy Spirit back into it. In the wonderful image that Pope Innocent III gives us, he's literally holding up the collapsing church. And I think he did it certainly in the 13th century, but in a weird way, he still does it now. As the Franciscan spirit, blows through the world even now, it's still supporting the church.
It's time now for our weekly question from one of our listeners. If you have a question, we'd love to hear it. Just visit askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question there on your phone, your computer, or your tablet. And every single week, we pick one question to answer here on the air. Today we answer a question dealing with one character trait of Francis, which you mentioned earlier, that of him as mystic. Many people describe him as a mystic. And so we have a great question today from David, a college student in New York, who wonders what it means to be a mystic today. So here's David.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is David, and I'm a college student from New York. The Jesuit theologian Karl Rahner said, "The Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist at all." What do you think of this idea, and what do you think it means to be a mystic today? Thank you. I love the show. God bless.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a good question. And I like that line from Rahner. I think he's right about it. Classically, a mystic is someone who has some kind of experiential contact with God. So we talk about the theologian who would know things about God, the ordinary believer who would go through, the liturgy and the sacraments and so on. But a mystic, we might press it and say, is someone who has a lived experience of God, that the divine life is something that they're in touch with in a conscious way. I think what Rahner was concerned about, and I am too, is a kind of dried out, arid, too scholastic, too intellectualized Christianity. God knows he was a great intellectual himself, but he was also a Jesuit. And so at the core of his spirituality was this very concrete friendship with Jesus Christ. And if you don't have that, Christianity will dry up. If you've got that, you can be as scholastic as you want, and you can be as analytical as you want. Fides quaerens intellectum, right? Faith seeking understanding. But mysticism is more closely tied to that fides, to faith, that you've got a lived experience of friendship with Christ. And if we don't have that, it will dry up. And it might remain as a sort of shell of itself, Christians talking about their doctrines. But it won't survive unless we become mystics. We become personally in contact with the Lord.
In addition to Francis, who would you identify as some of the other great mystics of our tradition?
Oh, maybe the greatest is St. John of the Cross. What I mean by that is someone who was able to write about the experience and express it at such a high level. I always tell my Spanish language friends, read John of the Cross in Spanish. He's one of the highest poets in the Spanish language tradition, and he writes these hundreds of pages of commentary on his poetry, and it's all about Christian mysticism. Teresa of Avila, of course, comes to mind. In our time, I have to say the Little Flower, whom I reverence, but she herself often said she didn't have any kind of extraordinary spiritual experiences. But, it doesn't have to be extraordinary. It doesn't have to be like locutions and visions. The mystic is someone who is in this steady, lived, personal contact with the Lord. And in that sense, I'd say Therese was indeed a mystic. Anyways, it's a wonderful topic maybe for another of our shows.
Well, thanks for listening to this episode on the pivotal players, specifically St. Francis. I want to encourage you to go pick up your copy of the Pivotal Players film series, and to help you do that, we have a special code for you. So listen carefully. If you use the coupon code FRAN1226, so that's FRAN 1226 altogether, if you use that when you order the series at pivotalplayers.com, you get $10 off. But the code is only available for the next 2 weeks, so you want to make sure to do it right now. So again, visit pivotalplayers.com, order your copy of the series, and use the coupon code FRAN1226. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show, and we'll see you next week.